In 1795, a country with a thousand-year history simply ceased to exist. Not conquered, not absorbed, erased. Three neighboring empires took out a map of Europe, drew lines across Poland, and divided every last village between them. The name Poland disappeared from official documents. Children were forbidden from speaking Polish in schools. Maps printed in London, Paris, and Vienna showed nothing but Prussia, Austria, and Russia where Poland used to be. For 123 years, an entire nation lived as ghosts on someone else's land. And yet, somehow, in 1918, Poland walked back onto the map like it had never left. So how does a country survive total deletion? How do you keep a nation alive when it has no borders, no army, no government, not even a legal right to exist? To understand that, we have to go back to a kingdom that was once one of the largest and most powerful states in all of Europe. Around the year 1569, Poland did something almost nobody else in Europe was doing. It merged peacefully with its neighbor, Lithuania, to form a single state called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Imagine a country stretching from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea, ruled not by an all-powerful king, but by a parliament of nobles who actually elected their monarchs. While the rest of Europe was burning witches and crowning absolute kings, Poland-Lithuania had religious tolerance, an elected throne, and one of the earliest written constitutions in the modern world. Jews fleeing persecution across Europe came here for safety. Protestants and Catholics lived side by side. For a while, it really did look like the future. But there was a fatal flaw baked right into the system. Any single noble in the Polish parliament could veto any law. One man, one shout of "I do not allow," and the entire government would freeze. It was called the Liberum Veto, and on paper it sounded noble, like a guarantee against tyranny. In practice, it was a wrecking ball. Foreign powers figured out very quickly that you didn't need to invade Poland. You just needed to bribe one nobleman. If this is the kind of story that grabs you, you'll probably want to subscribe, because what happens next is one of the strangest collapses in European history. By the 1700s, Poland was in serious trouble. The neighbors had been watching for decades, and they liked what they saw. To the west sat Prussia, a militarized kingdom ruled by Frederick the Great, a man who treated war the way other people treated chess. To the south sprawled the Austrian Habsburg Empire, ancient and hungry. And to the east loomed Russia under Catherine the Great, an empress with an appetite for territory that made even her advisors nervous. All three of them looked at Poland, this enormous country in the middle of their map, and saw the same thing, a feast that nobody was guarding. The Polish parliament couldn't pass a single meaningful reform. Every time someone tried to fix the Liberum Veto, foreign agents would pay a nobleman to shout it down. Every time someone proposed a modern standing army, the same thing happened. The Polish king at the time, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, was actually a brilliant man who loved books, art, and reform. But he had a small problem. He had been Catherine the Great's lover before becoming king, and Catherine had personally arranged his election to the throne. Everyone knew it. Half the country saw him as a Russian puppet from day one. Stanislaw, the Russians are massing troops on the border again. They're allies. They're not allies, they're owners. We just need to modernize the army. With what money? The nobles refuse to pay taxes. Then force them. I can't force them. That's the whole point of being Polish. Stanislaw, they're going to take pieces of the country. Then I'll write them a strongly worded letter. They'll laugh and take more. Then I'll write a longer letter. In 1772, the laughter ended. Russia, Prussia, and Austria sat down at a table and calmly divided up about a third of Poland between themselves. No real war, no battle, just signatures on paper. The Polish parliament was forced to ratify the theft of its own territory at gunpoint. Cities, farms, hundreds of thousands of people, gone overnight, now subjects of three different empires. This was the first partition, and it should have been the wake-up call of the century. For a few years, it actually was. Polish reformers got serious. They built schools, modernized the army, and in May of 1791, they did something that genuinely terrified every monarch in Europe. On the 3rd of May 1791, the Polish parliament passed a written constitution. It was the second written national constitution in the entire world, beaten only by the United States, and it landed in Europe like a bomb. It abolished the Liberum Veto. It strengthened the monarchy, just enough to make government function. It gave new rights to townspeople and protections to peasants. It was modern, it was bold, and it was exactly the kind of thing that absolute monarchs across Europe absolutely could not allow to exist next door to them. If Poland reformed itself and survived, what would stop their own subjects from getting ideas? Catherine the Great read the constitution and lost her mind. A reformed, functional Poland was the last thing Russia wanted on its border. She found a handful of Polish nobles who hated the new constitution because it threatened their personal power, paid them generously, and helped them form what was called the Targowica Confederation. These nobles literally invited Russian troops into Poland to crush the constitution and restore the old broken system. To this day, the word Targowica in Polish means treason of the highest possible order. Parents still use it as an insult. You're inviting Russian soldiers onto Polish soil. They're here to protect our ancient rights. They're here to protect Catherine's interests. The Constitution is tyranny. The Constitution is the only thing keeping Poland alive. Then Poland can die. Do you hear yourself? I hear a patriot defending tradition. You're going to be remembered as the man who killed his own country. I'll be remembered as a hero. You'll be remembered as a curse word. We'll see. He was remembered as a curse word. Russian armies poured in. The Polish army fought hard but was massively outnumbered. King Stanislaw, terrified and weak, eventually surrendered and joined the Targowica side himself, hopping to save what he could. He saved nothing. In 1793, Russia and Prussia carved off another huge chunk of Poland, the Second Partition. The country was now barely a third of its original size, a hollow shell with foreign troops walking through its capital. But Poland was not quite finished yet. One man, a soldier who had fought for American independence under George Washington himself, was about to come home and make the empires of Europe genuinely afraid for a few months. His name was Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and he was already a legend before he ever raised a sword for Poland. A few years earlier, he had crossed the Atlantic to fight in the American Revolution. He designed the fortifications at West Point. He served as a trusted engineer under George Washington. The Americans loved him so much that they gave him citizenship, land, and the rank of brigadier general. Thomas Jefferson called him the purest son of liberty I have ever known. When Kosciuszko finished helping America win its freedom, he sailed home to a Poland that desperately needed the same thing. In March of 1794, in the city of Krakow, Kosciuszko climbed onto a platform in the main market square and swore a public oath. He promised to fight for the freedom and survival of Poland or die trying. Then he did something nobody in Polish history had ever done. He called on the peasants, not just the nobles, not just the gentry, but ordinary farmers with scythes and pitchforks. He promised them freedom from serfdom if they fought. And they came, thousands of them. A few weeks later at the Battle of Raclawis, Kosciuszko's army, including a unit of peasant fighters armed mostly with farm tools sharpened into pikes, charged a Russian artillery position and captured the cannons. It was an underdog victory so dramatic that paintings of it still hang in Polish museums today. For one shining moment, it looked like Poland might actually claw its way back. General, the peasants want to know if you really meant it about freedom. I meant every word. Some of the nobles are angry. The nobles can be angry. The nobles also haven't been fighting Russian cannons with sticks. Will you sign it into law? I'll sign it tonight. They'll never forgive you. They don't have to forgive me. They have to live in a free country. And if we lose, then at least they tasted it once. That has to count for something. But the numbers were brutal. Russia poured in fresh armies. Prussia joined the attack. In October of 1794, at the Battle of Maciełowieś, Kosciuszko was wounded and captured. Legend says he cried out Finis Poloniae, the end of Poland, as he fell. He always denied saying it. But the empires of Europe were about to make those words true. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria sat down one final time. The Third Partition. They didn't take a piece. They took everything. Every village, every river, every city. They drew their lines straight through the heart of what was left of Poland and split it three ways. King Stanislaw was forced to abdicate. He was shipped off to Russia, where he died a few years later, lonely and broken, a man who had wanted to save his country and instead presided over its funeral. The neighboring powers were so thorough that they even signed a secret clause agreeing to never use the name Poland in any official document ever again. The word itself was supposed to be erased. On the map, Poland was gone. For the first time in over 800 years, there was no Polish state. But here's the strange thing about killing a country. You can take the land, you can take the army, you can even take the name. What you cannot take, it turns out, is the idea. Roughly 10 million people went to bed one night as Poles and woke up as subjects of three different empires, and almost none of them got the memo. In Russian-controlled Poland, the Tsar's officials banned the Polish language in schools and government. Children were beaten for speaking their own tongue in class. In Prussian Poland, German became mandatory. Polish names were changed on official documents. Catholic priests, who had always been the spine of Polish identity, were watched, arrested, and sometimes deported. In Austrian Poland, the rules were a little softer, but the goal was the same: erase the Pole. Replace him with a loyal imperial subject. So what do you do when your country has been deleted? You read a book. You sing a song. You whisper a poem to your children at bedtime. Across all three partitions, an underground network of teachers, writers, priests, and ordinary mothers began doing something extraordinary. They turned culture itself into a weapon. Polish history was taught in attics. Polish poetry was smuggled across borders. Mothers taught their kids to count and pray in Polish behind closed shutters. A nation that no longer existed on any map was being kept alive in living rooms. And then, just when the empires thought they had things under control, a short man with a tricorn hat showed up in Europe with a different idea entirely. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and by 1806 he was rearranging the map of Europe like it was furniture in his living room. He smashed Prussia at the Battle of Jena. He humbled Austria. He stared down Russia. And as his armies rolled east, tens of thousands of Polish soldiers rushed to join him. To Poland, Napoleon wasn't just a French emperor. He was the only man on the continent powerful enough to maybe, just maybe, put their country back on the map. Napoleon didn't quite restore Poland, but in 1807 he carved out a chunk of former Polish territory and created something called the Duchy of Warsaw. It wasn't called Poland. The name was still banned, but it had Polish laws, a Polish army, and Polish administrators. For a few brief years, it was the closest thing to a homeland that Poles had seen in over a decade. Polish soldiers fought and died for Napoleon from Spain to the gates of Moscow. They believed every battle was bringing their country one step closer to resurrection. Sir, half my regiment didn't come back from Russia. I know. We froze in those forests. I lost my brother in the snow outside Smolensk. He died for France, didn't he? He died for Poland. France was just where the paperwork was, and if Napoleon loses, then we lost a brother for nothing. No, then we lost a brother for an idea. The idea outlives the man. That's what makes it dangerous to empires. In 1815, Napoleon lost. The empires of Europe gathered at the Congress of Vienna to put the continent back the way they liked it. The Duchy of Warsaw was dismantled. A small puppet kingdom called Congress Poland was created under Russian control, with the Tsar himself as its king. It had a constitution on paper. In practice, Russia ran everything. The other Polish lands went back to Prussia and Austria. The map looked depressingly familiar, so the Poles did what they had been doing for a generation. They waited and they planned. In 1830, they rose up. In 1846, they rose up again. In 1863, they rose up one more time. Three major uprisings in 33 years. Every single one was crushed. Every single one ended with mass executions, mass deportations to Siberia, and tighter restrictions than before. But each one also did something the empires never expected. Each failed uprising created martyrs. And martyrs, it turns out, are harder to kill than soldiers. After the 1830 uprising collapsed, thousands of Polish officers, poets, and intellectuals fled west, mostly to Paris. This wave of exiles became known as the Great Emigration, and it changed everything. Because while Poland could not exist as a country, it could absolutely exist as an idea broadcast from cafes in France, concert halls in Vienna, and printing presses in London. In Paris, a young pianist named Frédéric Chopin sat down at a keyboard and turned grief into music. He had left Poland just before the 1830 uprising failed, and he would never see his homeland again. Every polonaise, every mazurka, every haunting nocturne he wrote was, in some quiet way, a love letter to a country that officially did not exist. When Europeans heard Chopin, they didn't just hear beautiful music. They heard Poland. The same was true of the poet Adam Mickiewicz, whose epic verses about Polish heroes were memorized by children in attics from Warsaw to Krakow to Poznan. This was the genius of stateless Poland. The empires controlled the land, the army, the courts, and the schools, but they could not control a piano. They could not control a poem whispered at a kitchen table. They could not control the Catholic Mass on Sunday morning, where priests slipped Polish history into sermons and grandmothers translated the meaning to grandchildren on the walk home. A whole nation was being passed down like a family heirloom. Babcia, why do we speak Polish at home if the teacher hits me for it at school? Because the teacher only owns the school. We own the house. And what about the country? The country is in here. She tapped her chest. They cannot reach in here with a stick. And one day you will speak Polish in the street. You will read Polish in the newspaper. You will hear Polish in the parliament. I will never see it. I might not see it, but you will, so learn your verbs. Meanwhile, in the Russian zone, the screws kept tightening. After the failed 1863 uprising, the Tsar's government launched something called Russification. The goal was simple: make the Poles stop being Polish. They had no idea what they were actually about to set in motion. Russification was an industrial-scale attempt to wipe out Polish identity. Polish was banned from schools entirely, even as a subject. All instruction had to be in Russian, including history, geography, even Catholic religion lessons. Polish street signs came down. Polish town names were changed to Russian ones. Polish universities were shut down or turned into Russian ones. Children who spoke Polish in the schoolyard were beaten by teachers and fined by inspectors. In one famous incident in 1901, a class of schoolchildren in the town of Wrzesnia went on strike because they refused to recite their Catholic prayers in German under the Prussian version of the same campaign. The youngest strikers were 7 years old. They were caned in front of their parents. The story spread across Europe and made the partitioning powers look exactly like what they were. Meanwhile, in the Prussian zone, the German government launched something called the Kulturkampf, a brutal effort to crush Polish Catholic identity and replace it with German Protestant loyalty. They tried to buy out Polish farmland and replace Polish farmers with German settlers. They created a settlement commission with massive funding to push Poles off their own soil acre by acre. And the Poles fought back with something nobody expected: money. They organized cooperative banks. They formed agricultural credit unions. They taught each other modern farming techniques. When a Polish farm came up for sale, Polish neighbors would pool their savings overnight to outbid the German settlement commission. The empire had tanks of cash. The Poles had each other. The Poles often won. In Austrian Poland, the rules were strangely gentler. The Habsburgs, juggling a dozen different nationalities, eventually decided it was easier to let the Poles run their own affairs in the region called Galicia. Polish became an official language there. Polish universities reopened in Krakow and Lwów. Polish politicians sat in the Vienna parliament. Galicia was poor, but it became a kind of cultural reservoir, the one place where Polish life could breathe almost freely. And then came the inventors, the engineers, the scientists. A young woman named Maria Skłodowska, born in Russian-occupied Warsaw, was forbidden from attending a Polish university because such a thing barely existed. She went to Paris, kept her Polish maiden name forever, and became the woman the world would know as Marie Curie. 2 Nobel Prizes, the first person in history to win them in 2 different sciences. A Pole from a country that did not exist. By the early 1900s, something quietly remarkable had happened. After more than a century of erasure, there were more Poles, speaking more Polish, reading more Polish books, and writing more Polish poetry than at any point before the partitions. The empires had tried to delete a nation and accidentally taught it how to live without a state. But ideas alone don't redraw maps. For that, you need a catastrophe big enough to shatter the 3 empires at the same time. And in the summer of 1914, exactly that catastrophe arrived. The First World War did something that had seemed impossible for 119 years. It put all three of Poland's occupiers on opposite sides of the same war. Russia stood with France and Britain. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together against them. For the first time since 1795, the three empires holding Poland down were aiming guns at each other instead of at the Poles. And then, one by one, those empires started to break. In 1917, Russia collapsed into revolution. The Tsar abdicated. The Bolsheviks seized power and pulled Russia out of the war in chaos. In November 1918, Austria-Hungary disintegrated into a dozen smaller states. Days later, Germany surrendered, and the Kaiser fled into exile. The three empires that had jointly buried Poland were now all gone, dead, or unrecognizable. The grave had cracked open at exactly the same moment from three different sides. On the 11th of November 1918, the same day the guns fell silent on the Western Front, a man named Joseph Pilsudski stepped off a train in Warsaw. He had spent his life fighting for Polish independence, often from a prison cell. He had built a Polish legion that fought during the war specifically to put Poland back on the map. Now, in a city that had been ruled from St. Petersburg for over a century, he was handed military authority by what was left of the local German command. 3 days later, he was declared head of state. Poland was back. Pilsudski, the Germans are leaving. Good. The Russians are too busy killing each other to stop us. Better. So what now? Now we build a country. From what? From everything they tried to take and couldn't. We have Polish railroads run by three different empires. We have three different currencies, three different legal codes. Then we'll need a lot of paperwork, and an army, and probably a war. He was right about the war. The new Poland was barely a few months old when the wars began. Border conflicts erupted on every side. Polish soldiers fought Germans in the west, Ukrainians in the southeast, Czechs in the south, and Lithuanians in the north. But the biggest fight was coming from the east. In 1920, Lenin's Red Army marched on Warsaw with the goal of crushing the new Polish state and pushing communist revolution all the way into Germany. The Bolsheviks were so confident that they were already drafting plans for a Soviet government in Warsaw. European newspapers wrote Poland's obituary for the second time in 125 years. Then came the Battle of Warsaw in August of 1920. Pilsudski personally led a brilliant counterattack that split the Red Army in half. The Soviets, on the verge of total victory, suddenly found themselves surrounded, shattered, and fleeing east. Diplomats across Europe called it the miracle on the Vistula. Historians today still rank it as one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century. Poland had not only refused to die in 1795, it had now refused to die in 1920. The country that empires had erased was now defending the borders of Europe itself. For the next 20 years, Poland lived again. It had a parliament, a currency, universities, a flag flying over its own buildings. It rebuilt railroads from scratch, unified three different legal systems into one, and educated a generation of children in their own language without fear. It was not a perfect country. It had poverty, political fights, and ethnic tensions. But it existed. And after 123 years of being a ghost, existing was everything. Of course, the story doesn't end there. In September of 1939, Nazi Germany invaded from the west, and the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was carved up yet again. The Second World War would kill roughly 6 million Polish citizens, including nearly the entire Polish Jewish population, in some of the darkest chapters in human history. After the war, Poland spent another 45 years under Soviet control before finally winning real independence again in 1989. But here's the thing the empires never understood. You can take the land. You can ban the language. You can change the maps. You cannot delete a people who refuse to forget who they are. Poland proved that once. It proved it again. And if history is any guide, it will probably have to prove it a third time someday. If you made it this far, you probably love history that refuses to stay buried. Subscribe for more stories like this. Hit the like button if Poland's survival amazed you, and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time.